My name is John Krupsak, and welcome everyone to the CCSN Community College STEM Network Research to Practice Clinic. We're very excited today to have a super timely topic on co-requisite remediation. Um, but first, I'll just do some quick introductions. I'm going to introduce myself and then pass the mic over to co-moderator Michelle and our speaker today, Dan Douglas, to introduce himself. I'm currently a professor of engineering at Hope College, which is a liberal arts college, four-year college in Western Michigan. Previously, I was a NSF program officer, and I was the lead program officer for the STEM program for several years. So that's kind of my background relevant to two-year colleges. And the co-moderator and the PI of our CCSN is Michelle Vanoy. So, Michelle, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, thanks. Yeah, so I'm Michelle Vanoy, Director of the Education and Employment Research Center and a PI on the CCSN, and thrilled today to be hosting Dan Douglas to share work on co-requisite remediation. I'll let John take over, but welcome to everybody. I'm really glad that you're all here and joining us, and look forward to a conversation following this or throughout.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And we'd encourage participants you can please introduce yourself in the chat, just your name, institution, maybe your interests, a little bit about the CCSN. Our goal is to create a community around various aspects relevant to STEM education in the two-year college environment. Um, Today will be one aspect of that, our research to practice clinics. The idea of the clinics is exactly, hopefully, exactly what it says. Translating research to practice, bridging the gap between um, the rigorous research and the practical issues that STEM educators struggle with in the two-year colleges. And today, our speaker is going to be Dan Douglas. Now, our goal here is to have plenty of time for interaction and engagement. So after Dan gets underway, feel free to put questions in the chat. I'll leave it up to Dan to either address them as they come up or take breaks. And we're planning to have an extensive amount of time at the end for discussion and working over some of the things that may come up. So no further ado, Dan, why don't you take it over, introduce yourself, and the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Douglas. I am an assistant professor in sociology at Montclair State University. Before that, and up until now, through the present, I have also worked with Michelle's team at Rutgers for many years. Some of the things I'm going to show you here come from my time at Rutgers. But I think importantly, for the purpose of this presentation, I've spent my entire adult professional life studying co-requisite remediation. The first study, which we will talk about today, was 12 or 13 years ago, before people really had started even using that word. I'm happy to have folks ask questions in chat throughout. I'll do my best to monitor. I've got a nice large screen so I have the chat window open, so I should be able to see things. But if you want to use the hand raising functions or anything to let me know that you're looking to ask a question, go for it. And I'll try and run through things relatively quick, so again we have some time for discussion. So here we are. Just quick presentation roadmap. We'll talk quickly about traditional remediation so we can juxtapose it to co-requisite remediation. I'm then going to go through 3 experiments, randomized control trial studies, that I did over the last 10 years of co-requisite mathematics. I'll go through a synthesis of those studies plus other impact studies that have been done on co-requisite, and I'm going to focus on mathematics throughout. There is co-requisite English. We'll talk a little bit about the details of co-requisite support and how those relate to student success, and just a quick note on instructional challenges, which again I think is still an emerging thing, because as we're implementing co-requisites more and more, we're going to get a literature, even if we don't really have one yet, on the instructional challenges related to co-requisite courses. So, to say briefly, right, we know that the theory behind remedial coursework is to strengthen students' skills so that they're prepared for college level work. Typically, remediation is delivered as prerequisite courses in either math or English. And those courses are prerequisites insofar as if you do not pass them, you cannot enroll in your college level gateway courses in the same subject. Sometimes remedial courses also bar, like non-completion bars access to other college level courses beyond the intended subject. But importantly, and folks at CCRC did a great job of kind of reframing the remedial discussion. Remediation is also a sequence that spans from the initial placement in a remedial course or a college level course. Sometimes you could be placed in many levels below in remediation. So you might be 3 courses away from a college level course in mathematics. And so the sequence spans from that initial moment of placement through the first level college level course, or what we usually call the gateway course. And so if we theorize remediation not just as a course or not, but as a sequence, you get a new level of insight about remediation. So as a sequence, when you're placed into a remedial sequence, students placed into those sequences tend to have lower rates of college persistence, degree completion, and transfer. Here we usually mean vertical transfer from community college to 4-year. Those lower rates of student success are disproportionately found among low-income students and students of color. And a phenomenon that was recently interestingly identified by looking at high school to college data was students getting caught in what are called math traps, in which they do not, in college, students fail to reach the level of mathematics coursework that they had attained in high school. So they might have taken an algebra course, slid back into a pre-algebra course, and never in college got back past that algebra course. So they ended up at a lower level of college math attainment than high school. Remediation, I like to think about the history, right? We've had remedial courses in American colleges and universities since the founding of higher education institutions in the United States. Harvard had remedial courses for students. And we have to think about this as the way that American higher education thinks of itself is a place of start here, go anywhere. That no matter when you enter the educational pipeline, we can find a way for you to get to reach the highest rungs of educational attainment, but there might be obstacles on the way. Remediation grows for 2 reasons. One, the catchment population of colleges and universities grows, particularly since World War II. And so you have a lot of populations who are not typically college going populations now being courted into the institutions. And so need for remediation grows. And then the other thing that happens is you have a growth of math standardized testing, particularly since No Child Left Behind Act in 2000, which really turbocharged the amount of testing that was going on in K-12, and placement tests and testing companies started building placement tests that community colleges then used for college placement activities. Theoretically, we can relate remediation to changes in higher education policy around the country related to open admissions, open access, and to a phenomenon we know better in the K-12 world of educational tracking. Insofar as remediation kind of delays full access to college, right? It still preserves access. You can still come to college, but you won't be a full member of the college community because you're still having to retake high school work prior to, and you're not getting credit, and you may also be spending money. This leads to as tracking has declined in the K-12 sector, where the American population has less appetite for tracking its middle school and high school students. Tracking has kind of been shifted in this way to post-secondary education. As a sociologist, I think about the phenomenon of labeling and the idea of social stigma, that students who are tracked at any level, but here we're talking about community colleges, and are being effectively said, welcome to college, but please go back to high school. There's this phenomenon that can affect the individual's sense of themselves. Am I a real college student? Do I really belong here if I'm being asked to repeat high school level work? In terms of time and resources, students and institutions spend a lot of money on remedial sequences. Fairly recent data suggests that institutions and higher education spend upwards of $1 billion a year on remediation. So it is a very, very large enterprise, a very large thing that colleges are doing. Corequisite remediation, as opposed to prerequisite sequences, seeks to provide students with more or less immediate access to credit-bearing college-level courses, while concurrently offering targeted academic support to address students' developmental needs. So rather than saying, welcome to college, I need you to complete these high school courses first, we can still recognize that a college student may need some developmental support, but still bring them right into that college level course and say, let me meet your needs around that, right? And let's see how we can meet your developmental needs while you take college level courses. As in terms of a theory of change, why would this do better than the prerequisite model? At the very least, from that sequence perspective, it shortens the sequence, shortens the path both to taking courses in a major and of course to degree completion or transfer. To the extent that their students are invited straight into college level courses, we may reduce that feeling of stigma and increase the concurrent sense of belonging. And to the extent that this happens around other dev ed reform and mathematics reform movements in community college, co-requisite probably provides a better possibility of curricular alignment, which says if you need to take a certain gateway math course, I can align your developmental content to meet the needs of that college level gateway course. To that extent, it might increase students' interest in schooling and perhaps also in mathematics that says, oh, this is relevant to the math that I need for my major. And so these are three ways we might think of a theory of change for co-rec. How did co-rec develop? Colleges began in earnest experimenting with co-rec in the early 2010s. Community College of Baltimore had what's called the Accelerated Learning Program in English. Carnegie Mellon University created Quantways and Statways, which again, we're getting to this point that co-rec doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's also this math pathways movement, right? And an experiment that I did with my colleagues at CUNY was looking at co-requisite with statistics, which was the first and longest longitudinal experiment related to co-requisite, still is, though others have come up and have confirmed some of our results. From the early 2010s through today, based on some of the evidence that we were finding, that researchers were finding about these approaches, and advocacy from organizations, I think among them like Complete College America, state systems began to require or strongly encourage shifts to the co-rec model. Tennessee in 2015 was the first to mandate co-requisite. California with AB 1705, Colorado with its own House bill, were not mandates for co-requisite, but they were mandates for increased access to and increased placement into college level courses. So their laws effectively were a de facto move toward co-requisite. And the Education Commission of the states this year found that there are 29 states that either require or offer co-requisite support. And this is in both subjects. It's differential. I think it's fewer in math. So just to name those other two big things that are happening around co-requisite, the first is multiple measures, right? So if the remedial sequence starts with placement, right? And placement in the early 2000s relied solely on high stakes tests. Researchers, and this is specifically CCRC did this, found that there was a high rate of underplacement, that those standardized tests tended to place more students into remediation, even many of whom who would have been successful in gateway courses. And so multiple measures is a reform that says, instead of placing students just on the basis of a one-off high stakes test, let's use your high school transcripts. If you've got other admissions test scores, SATs and ACTs, and we might even give some non-cognitive assessments about what's your ability level, what's your feeling about mathematics or English, right? We can use those things to inform placement decisions. There are a number of studies that have randomly assigned students to go through a multiple measures assessment rather than a single test-based placement, and we've seen lower rates of remedial placement from that. Math pathways, as we said, pathways are intended to relate gateway math to students' intended fields of study. So instead of requiring everyone to go through the algebra to calculus sequence, here we might say, oh, you're a social scientist, we're going to give you statistics as your gateway math requirement. Oh, you're a liberal arts major, we're going to give you more of like a quantitative reasoning course. oh, you're in manufacturing, we might tailor your mathematics requirement to the kind of math you're going to need to run CNC machines. And so this idea of aligning mathematics content to the major field of study to students' desired careers is what these two things are happening alongside co-requisite. And in fact, it makes it hard to assess what co-req does it on its own because a lot of these other things are happening at the same time. I always call community colleges intervention-rich environments. And so when you're trying to disentangle the effect of one intervention from another, and both of them happened at the same time, it complicates efforts to look at effects. Three models of co-requisite, three ways this can go, right? And I haven't, we'll get to it in a second, right? So how do colleges actually deliver? How do they implement co-req on the ground? One way is a method called serial enrollment that says, okay, you want students to be able to complete their gateway math in their first semester. We're still going to give them a remedial course, a full remedial course, and a full college level course. We're just going to make each of those like 7.5-week courses that are like longer, like compressed courses. But if that model means that a student can still fail the prereq and not make it into college level, we could question whether or not that model is co-requisite. But it is still achieving the goal, perhaps in a law that says a student needs to be able to complete their gateway math course in a year or within the first semester. Simultaneous delivery is, instead of compressing anything, just going, you're going to take these two courses side by side, a 3-credit college level and a 4-credit developmental. Both of these models, serial and simultaneous, create some scheduling issues for students, which is to say, you've got to fit a lot of content, a lot of credit hours into your first semester just wrapped around your dev math course. And let's say if you also needed co-requisite English, you might not be able to find time for those in your schedule, especially if you're a part-time student. But those are two ways. And a third way, the embedded approach says, we're going to give you the college level course. That's the only course you're going to take. We might add an SI supplemental instruction module, or we might add some tutoring that's required that would only add maybe another hour or 2 hours a week. It might be more flexible. And so that's the embedded approach. And this, to me, conceptually feels the most true to the idea of co-requisite that says, you don't need a full, we're going to try and minimize the amount of developmental content that you see. And I'll talk about why I believe that. That's not just a hunch. And researchers, myself included, have examined both the overall effectiveness of co-requisite mathematics as well as examine the differences among these models. And so we'll get into 3 studies. When I was at Rutgers, 2 experiments happened, both under the auspices of the same Department of Education First in the World grant. Bergen Community College was one site and Union County College was a second site. Bergen used a serial compression approach that we just talked about with compressed schedules. Math faculty at Bergen were strongly opposed to the embedded model of removing the standalone developmental content, so they opted to compress. And for students who also needed developmental arithmetic, they were offered a summer bridge course that they could take, which was like an online Emporium-based model using Alex software. So students who needed algebra got the serial compression in the fall semester. Those who needed arithmetic started in the summer and then moved into the serial compression model in the fall. Students in this experiment were first-time in college students who were interested in non-STEM majors and had to meet certain thresholds on the Accurate Placer Placement test. They needed to get above a 30 in arithmetic and a 40 in algebra. And continuing, this is just the path diagram that says, like, the top of the top panel is the traditional remedial model that says, if you were placed into arithmetic, you needed to take a 1-semester course in arithmetic, Math 101, a 1-semester course in algebra, so again, you're in your first fall, your first spring, and you don't get to your college level math course until your second year of college. If you were in the experiment group and you placed into arithmetic, you would start in our summer bridge program, and it was a 2-week program. And then you would take a 7.5-week algebra course, followed by a 7.5-week college level gateway course. So this is how this is what serial compression will look like in practice. We were having trouble with recruitment, so ultimately we picked twice as many experiment students as control students, a 2-to-1 assignment strategy, and we got about 230 students enrolled in this experiment. And we opted to measure outcomes. Well, first thing is random assignment worked. This was a high quality experiment as judged by the federal government's What Works Clearinghouse. We measured outcomes after 3 years so that those control group students would have time to complete their math requirements if they were going to. We found that students in the intervention group were 13 percentage points less likely to have completed developmental math because many of them were less likely to have taken it. But they were 30 percentage points more likely to have completed college level math at the end of 3 years. They completed an additional 4 college level credits, meaning in not mathematics, other than that their gateway math course, which we theorize as they had better access to more college level courses for which math was a prerequisite. And at the end of 3 years were 8.5 percentage points more likely to have completed a degree. Those results are marginally statistically significant, but I present them because it's a relatively small experiment. What I'll say about arithmetic and about the need for like full developmental courses, we found that many of those students who took that summer bridge course in arithmetic completed all of the things they needed, which was usually just fractions and decimals. They completed all the things they needed to in their ALEX software within 11 hours or so. So instead of a 15-week developmental arithmetic course, they just needed 11 hours in front of a computer to prove that they knew how to do fractions and decimals and refresh themselves on that. And when you use a single one-off placement test, that can consign a student to an additional semester in a remedial pipeline. And this is one of those things that like was, even though it was like not the headline finding of the experiment, was like, oh, this is big, this is important. Union County College, the second site, was more supportive of scaling co-requisites and de-emphasizing traditional dev ed. They allowed any first-time in college student assessed as needing remedial math in any major to be randomized into the experiment. Their intervention was actually just a waiver from the developmental requirement, attended by an encouragement to attend weekly appointments at the college's academic learning center. So if you were in the experiment group, you got emails weekly from the project director, please go to tutoring. But they were not required to do so. So this is a very, very light co-requisite course. Faculty were not told if they had intervention group students in their course, where at Bergen, students were in a cohort. All the students in the experiment were in classes together. These students were mainstreamed into college level courses. And importantly, these students were not required to enroll in math at any point. They were just given a waiver and allowed to do what they would with it. Ultimately, a much larger experiment, 1,600 students across 2 semesters. Random assignment also produced balanced groups, though there was a slightly higher proportion of Pell Grant recipients in the intervention group, so we controlled for that in a regression model. Same thing after 3 years. Intervention group students were 12.5 points more likely to have passed college level math, the throughput metric. They were more likely to have finished. They were also part of that is that they were more likely to have taken it for sure, because they were offered a college level course. And part of it was because the course completion rates were better. Importantly, these students were no more likely to remain in college or to graduate, so there was no statistically significant completion effect. And when we controlled for that difference in the number of Pell recipients, the result was unchanged. So it wasn't the difference between the 2 groups that made the effect. And so those are the 2 that we did in New Jersey. The one that I spent the most time in my life doing was at the City University of New York in fall 2013. We started this study. And here the intervention is college level statistics with co-rec support, where the last two experiments, one was algebra, right? Or contemporary math. And the other was whatever math course the student needed. Here we're looking specifically at statistics with a co-rec support. Here we're looking not at a serial compression, but we're looking at an embedded model, which we'll talk about in a second. Contextually, the departments were resistant to placing remedial students directly into the college level algebra course, which is why statistics ended up being the course. And system policy precluded for direct placement into college level courses. There had to be a remedial component if the students were going to go, if the students had remedial needs. That's New York, that's CUNY's policy. So we followed it. And that's how we ended up studying co-rec. Again, this happened before there was a strong evidence base or even a terminology for co-requisite. We had 3 community colleges, 900 students assigned to 3 groups: the business as usual remediation at CUNY, remediation with a weekly workshop, which is like a remedial with co-rec, or with tutoring support, and then college level statistics with the same sort of weekly workshop. First time in college students had to be non-STEM, because the statistics course wouldn't have met the requirement for the STEM major, and placed into the highest level of remediation. So these were the most high performing of students who needed remediation. They only would have needed 1 level of remediation, where at the time CUNY had 2. The students, the weekly workshops were peer-led, supplemental instruction, which is to say that the developmental content was tied to the statistics course that they were taking. It was instructor balance. This experiment was extra robust in this way, which is to say that one charge might be, oh, statistics classes are taught by more generous graders than algebra courses, and so the pass rate differences might be because of easier grading. In this experiment, each participating instructor taught a section of business as usual, of algebra with workshop, and of statistics with workshop. So the same teachers taught across sections, which reduces the possibility that this is due to differential instructor treatment. Again, this was followed for a long time. So while the first 2 experiments followed for 3 years, this we follow up to 7 years. We focus really just on the business as usual versus the co-rec with statistics groups, which were of equal size. The groups were balanced. 1 year after the intervention, co-rec students were 16.5 percentage points more likely to have completed their gateway math course. They'd accumulated, like the Bergen students, 4 additional college level credits. And there was no retention effect. So retention was unrelated to co-requisite participation. We took surveys of the students, and this is back to the questions of stigma and belonging, right? And views about mathematics. So these the co-requisite students had more positive orientation towards mathematics. They felt it was more useful, and they felt more capable of learning it. So they had more of that mathematics self-efficacy. They were also more likely to form self-initiated study groups. And so the subjective effects of co-requisite were evident here as well, beyond just the objective outcomes. Now you get to see a graph that summarizes 10 years of my academic life. So here goes. It has 2 x-axes, it has 2 y-axes, and it has 3 pairs of lines. Red is always the business as usual group, blue is always the co-requisite group, and we should start with the short dashed lines, the ones that are for associate's degree completion. And what we see is that by the summer, fall of 2016, and I think I can annotate this, by the summer, fall of 2016, that difference in associate's degree completion is that 16% of the elementary algebra group had completed an associate's degree. compared to 24 or 25% of the co-rec group. So that's a 50% increase in the associate's degree completion rate over 3 years. If we move to the 5-year outcomes, summer, fall 2018, we had about 7.5% of the elementary algebra, the business as usual group, completing a bachelor's degree against 13% of the associate's degree. And no, it was 6.5 versus 13, and that's doubling. So twice the number, twice the proportion of the co-rec group had completed a bachelor's degree within 5 years compared to the business as usual group. The last thing we looked at, we had students' earnings after college, and what we found was that and these are the solid lines in, hang on, I was having fun with that, but it's all right. In calendar year 2019 and calendar year 2020, the co-rec group earned significantly more money on the order of $3,000 to $5,000. And when we think about that, these are mostly traditional age college students, that's a substantial earnings advantage. And so what we found was at the 3, 5, and 7, 6, and 7 year marks, we found substantial treatment effects for the co-requisite intervention. And it seems it seems kind of, maybe at first blush doesn't make a whole lot of sense that co-requisite would impact earnings, but when we decomposed that, we did some adjusted regression models. What we found was that the thing that seems to drive those earnings effects is that the co-rec students had shorter time to degree. What does that mean? Shorter time to degree, quicker out into the labor force, where your earnings will grow with your tenure of full-time employment. So we're getting students through their degrees quicker, which is getting them into the labor force and getting them embedded into their jobs, which is increasing their salaries. That's at least the hypothesis we're working on from the data analysis we have. I can get rid of those annotations, I hope. There we go. The last thing I'll leave you with about this experiment is at the end of 7 years, about equal proportions, 49 versus 52, are no degree not enrolled. What I take away from this is that co-requisite is not a silver bullet, right? It is not the only thing that's going to matter for student degree completion. It is a first-year intervention. The phenomenon of student persistence and student degree completion is not a sole function of whether or not you got straight into college level gateway math. That's not the truth. There's so many other things that influence students' persistence and completion of college degrees. But we did move the needle on timely degree completion for a substantial group of students with this intervention. That, move on. Those are 3 experimental randomized controlled trials, but I've also taken the time to review all of the robust evidence that we have, the most kind of rigorous evidence that we have in the form of monitoring studies, quasi-experiments, and other randomized controlled trials, just to see where because I was curious, where do my estimates fit in? Where do the estimates from these experiments fit in? And what is the evidence base on college course completion, on retention, on completion? And I won't go into the details about the types of studies, only to say that monitoring studies are quick and dirty. Institutional research people do these all the time just to see when things change, what our course completion rates look like. Quasi-experiments are difficult statistical analyses, but they allow for some degree of causal attribution. We can say this causes that, or at least with some degree of accuracy, we can say this causes that. Where RCTs, the whole point is to be able to say this causes that. And that's what we did with those last 3 experiments. So every study that I reviewed that looks at co-requisite mathematics found a positive throughput on that. Does co-requisite lead more students to complete their gateway math course? Yes, it does. What do we see is that the estimates are more precise as we use a more precise instrument. So monitoring studies have wildly different between 11 and 50 percentage point boosts in throughput rates. We narrow it down with quasi-experiments, 12 to 19%, 7-point range, and a 6-point range when we use an RCT. But it's all positive and all greater than 10 percentage points. So if you want better throughput rates on those gateway courses, co-rec seems to be the intervention. There aren't a lot of studies on medium or long-term impacts. In terms of long-term completion impacts, there's my study and Christine Mocher's study in Florida, and those are the only two long-term studies of degree completion. And what we found was between a 3 and 8 percentage point. The studies we've done have found between 3 and 8 percentage points on completion, and she found 5 percentage points on transfer. And good, but not a lot. We don't know enough, right? Medium-term impacts. Completing a second math course. A few studies have looked at this, and it's 2.5 to 5 percentage points. Retention is actually crosses the line. For some studies, we've seen a negative impact on retention. Some we've seen positive. The experiments that I've done found no statistically significant estimates on retention. And like I say, I think retention is a bit more of a complicated phenomenon. Changing your math course should change your math course success, right? But should it change whether or not you stay in college? I think that's a bit more it's a bit more complicated than that. Details. This was another study that we did at Rutgers, along with University of Michigan colleagues. We looked at Colorado Community College System, the 13 CCCS colleges. Again, Colorado had a law that asked for implementation of some version of COREC, or at least minimizing placement into remedial courses. And so we were able to examine how did those different colleges comply with that law and what effect did it have. And so we looked at these features of Corequisite, whether or not students were part of a cohort, what kind of instructional format Corequisite took, how were Corequisites scheduled relative to the college level course, whether or not they were learning communities where the same instructor taught the course, or if a different instructor taught COREC, who were the instructors assigned, full-time versus part-time, and whether or not class sizes were large and small. So this allowed us just to kind of look at, do these different details impact student success? And again, I'm just focusing on math. We did English as well. And we also looked at how co-requisites looked and how student success was impacted by these designs for the different types of college level courses that had co-recs: algebra, statistics, and Q-Lit, or quantitative literacy. In terms of what Colorado community colleges did, most students ended up in courses that were in a cohort. And again, we can go back and say that that's the same students are in the college level course and the support course, right? Most of them had the same instructor for both courses. Most were delivered sequentially. Either the co-rec happened immediately before the college level course, like same day of the week, same time, but like right before, or immediately after. Utilized the just-in-time format, which is to say that the content was tied to the unit of that day, right? What you were learning in your support course was related to what you were learning at that time in the course. And the courses were relatively small and enrolled about 13 students. What mattered for course completion? The students who were in a cohort where they saw the same students in their co-rec course, their support course, as they did in their college level course, had better odds of passing that course. Students who saw their co-rec support happen right after their college level course were more likely to pass that course and were more likely to pass a second math course. So that posterior timing seemed to have a better impact on students. Probably because it took the form of more structured review that they could immediately reflect on what they were learning and then get the content that they needed for that. When we looked at specific math courses, students for whom algebra was the gateway course benefited more from being part of a cohort than students in other subjects or other math courses, and benefited more from that posterior sequencing. And students in co-requisite statistics seem to benefit from anterior pre-course support and posterior sequencing as opposed to unsequenced, I suppose. Yeah, that's what happened there. Is that so? What do we learn overall? Is that sequencing, having the co-rec be attached to the support module will attach to the college level course mattered. And that being part of a cohort where your same students over a long, same students in both the co-rec section and in the college level course, these were two features that really mattered for students succeeding in these courses. To summarize, co-rec works, especially for short-term outcomes, around succeeding in the clearing the gateway math requirement. And if that's something that we're concerned with, then, I remember when we were doing the details matter study, the lead author was like, just do co-rec. I mean, that seems to be like the most basic answer is like, just do co-rec, but beyond that, some of the details matter. But doing co-rec is not as easy, and I learned this a lot by trying to implement experiments on co-requisite. Faculty, I think, are, I would say justifiably apprehensive about, especially top-down, do this quick mandates to move to co-requisite, because it requires a lot of resources to do that sort of institutional transformation. And co-requisites are a different pedagogical animal than our standalone college level or standalone dev courses, because they are blended environments where you're meeting students' kind of pre-existing needs for foundational skills alongside trying to teach them something new. Sharon Avni and her colleague have done some studies, particularly in co-requisite English. So there's not a whole lot of kind of qualitative implementation studies. There's actually a really cool one that CCRC did recently that I didn't turn into a slide deck here. But a big problem that faculty have reported is like, if you've only ever taught college level or only have ever taught developmental, you're adding new things and also adding new students, right? Then all of a sudden you've got multiple ability levels, perhaps, right, in the same class. Pedagogically, co-requisite courses have to utilize that additional instructional time, which is either the SI module, or if you're doing like a what do you call it, a simultaneous delivery, you've got to use that extra instructional time to meet students' developmental needs. And importantly, and so again, learning how to do that, learning how to blend those two pieces of content together meaningfully is a new skill for a lot of faculty members, because again, the developmental landscape, we spend $1 billion a year teaching developmental courses. They often have their own faculty. At some schools like Bergen, they had their own department. Developmental math was a separate department from college level math. And so bringing co-requisite is trying to bring two departments together, to say nothing of like in the individual course, blending a lot of different learning styles. But importantly, what Avni and Finn found was that teaching co-requisites courses led instructors to do more scaffolding, both in their co-requisite courses and in their standalone college level courses. Because what they recognized is that a lot of the strategy they were learning to teach their co-requisite students or their co-requisite sections also worked really well in their college level sections. So they were able to provide more ongoing support to even the students who weren't placed as needing co-requisite. So instructional challenges, but also instructional opportunities. And Kathleen Alme, who does a ton of work helping schools scale co-requisite, has wrote very recently, like 3 days ago, so I threw it in as a bullet point, that about the degree to which faculty buy-in matters when you're trying to scale co-requisite. So there's a lot of laws, there's a lot of policy coming top down, but at the same time, we understand that there's this wall that often administrative and legislative mandates don't breach. And the only way to breach that, to do co-requisite well and meaningfully and really serve students, is to integrate faculty and get that buy-in. I'll stop there and give us 15 minutes for questions.
Great, thanks, Dan. This is fantastic. Any questions? Encourage you to either unmute and ask, or you could put it in the chat if whatever is easier for you.
Hi, Justin.
Hi, I have a question, Dan. I don't want to take over if anyone else does too, but super interesting. I think this is great work. I love the RCT designs. Um, my question comes into the different types of co-requisites, which or models, in which I didn't even realize there were,
Yeah.
varying types, and it seems like there's some like within variation that you could probably try to think about too. Because designing these and implementing them seems can be challenging, especially with the buy-in of the actual institution. But in terms of like the embedded, which you described, co-requisite model, what does and it seems like it can take varying, it can incorporate different things like tutoring and as well as instructors being involved. Qualitatively, I think there could be a question here, right? Like speaking to instructors and students based on who how they're experiencing this type of co-requisite training. And I'm wondering even like anecdotally if you like how do students think or feel about these different models. I don't know if there seems like there might be some qualitative work being done, but to really understand these experiences of instructors and what the tutoring may actually look like that is part of the embedded because I feel like that could be hard to control for in any type of experiment because they may have different styles of tutoring or they may be offered at different times and may be voluntary versus mandatory. I don't know if those are types of variables or factors that you can consider in a controlled or an RCT versus something qualitative that can help inform.
Well, again, so we had this, right? So in the CUNY experiment, it was peer led, it was SI, and it was for those students, right? So the tutoring or the supplemental instruction was part of the course, right? And it was also, it was not consequential to their attendance and it was not consequential to their grade, but they were certainly expected to attend, and that was clear in the syllabus, right? And so they attended, and what you can see is that, especially, and I think here this might have been a benefit of the peer-led model, that the students felt more comfortable with self-initiating study groups was probably because they were working like in a group of college students, because the peer tutor was just an upper level student at the community college. So I think they were like, oh, we learn math by working with other students, right? And so they kind of just mirrored that for themselves. At Union, where there was this encouragement to attend the academic learning center, right? But it was not required. And the ALC exists. The students can use the ALC for anything that they want to use it for. So they were just kind of going, yeah, there's this thing you can do, and we recommend that you do it. We knew that attendance at the ALC was low among even those in the experiment, so they didn't do it. And I think that's because it wasn't made special for them, right? It wasn't made as like, this is something that is for you. This is something that we're doing specifically to help you. It was just, you should go to tutoring, and that's how we're supporting your the developmental needs. And so that's among the 3 experiments I did, that one showed the weakest relationship to any outcome. Like it had a throughput, no surprise. And I think part of throughput there is just that many students are misplaced into remedial who could have otherwise been successful in college level, just did a bad test, right? Like a bad placement test. But we saw no further outcomes. And again, I think it was because of the weakness of the intervention. So the reason that literature needs to develop and is developing around what the details are and how the details shake out is precisely what you're saying, that there's not only need to know how instructors can best deliver, but like what surrounding supports work, right? The thing with the CUNY experiment that I think makes it such a robust success is that, and our peer reviewers on the 3rd paper said, isn't this pathways and co-requisite? Yes, yeah, it is. So these 2 things don't exist outside of each other. It was that these students were taking a course that was more likely to be, related to their field of study, because they'd indicated that they were trying to go into liberal arts, social sciences, where statistics was going to be useful. And they got the reduced stigma of being in college level, but also going straight into the math course that they needed. So I think there was like, a confluence of factors that went on. In terms of like student experiences, I mean, I always remember a couple of students that I interviewed connected to the evaluation at Bergen, you know, talking about this being the first time that they felt successful at mathematics, right? And I think that was owing to who the instructors were who were teaching those experimental sections, but also to the idea that they were like really making progress. I think they felt their progress in real time, like, oh, I'm really getting these requirements done. And the cohort-based, sequentially, you know, built model of like, and again, I don't love that version, the serial compression approach, but with the right instructor and with the, you know, and with the right supports surrounding it, it can work. Other questions, other comments?
I have another one, but I can wait if anyone else wants to hop in.
Yeah.
Go for it, Justin. Yeah.
Go for it, man.
Okay, thanks. And you mentioned this before earlier or at the end of your presentation, Dan. And this kind of was reflected in some of the K-12 stuff I did during my own dissertation, is the differences in supports or how co-requisite might be used among math and versus English.
Yep.
And whether there are studies people are thinking about or doing that, you know, show that some things work better for math because of the type of learning and instruction it requires versus English, and whether those are there are different outcomes based on, you know, the type of model you may use or approach you may have based on that particular subject, right?
The detailed study in Colorado showed that there weren't as many details that mattered in English as mattered in math. So like, I think it's like the dosage and like the structure of co-requisite support seem to matter more intensely for math. I think there's another aspect here, which is that the politics of co-rec English have not been nearly as fraught as the politics of co-rec math. The English faculty at every community college that I've been to where they're working on co-rec have been more supportive and more open to moving from pre-rec to co-rec. And so I think the reason you get more heterogeneity in math is because there's more kind of, you know, I think the faculty are have more reservations about what's being done with co-rec, right? So you get a lot more heterogeneity. There's just kind of a symptom of that, right? Where in English, I think it's much more homogeneously implemented and the faculty seem much more into it. I think it differs between the only other place where we see co-requisite is like ESL, like in English as a second language, and that's a bit more thorny. I think for the same reasons that mathematics is. But I think, again, the details seem to matter less in the work that we did. Others may find differently. There's one RCT by Miller and a couple of others on co-rec that shows similar impacts for English, and there are some quasi experiments. Like I have another table just like the one that I showed for English as well. And again, throughput works. Medium term outcomes sparse, but pretty positive. There's no long-term evidence on English. No one's followed it long enough to know. And again, I think part of the reason why you're going to see different evidence bases for the two is because English is being more readily adopted, so that transformation is happening, and you don't have the need for like English pathways in the same way that you do for math pathways. Math is just more of a complicated puzzle for solving both the remedial issue and the gateway question. So I think it's just a much more complicated landscape. Sure, Eliza.
Oh, I'm muted. I was gonna ask, do you think that the geography of the particular schools, because I'm thinking those are North Jersey colleges and New York. I mean, I guess Colorado would probably have there's rural and urban environments. Do you think that has any impact? And then did you look at age? Like, were there any differences based on like a traditional age college student versus an adult student?
Age, I'm going to say that I didn't have like age was a covariate in the model and didn't come up statistically significant, but I'm not going to say that based on that I investigated age, right? Like that's a really, really loose investigation of age. Yeah, gender and race again controlled in models, right? Importantly, we didn't find any gender difference in the CUNY experiment, so there was no gender difference in the treatment effect. There was no race ethnic effect in the like difference in the treatment effect. So we had those things. Urban versus rural colleges. Yes, Colorado, the implementation of Corequisite was most quick and robust at your urban colleges, Community College of Aurora, or Aurora Community College, CCD, Community College Denver. And I think it's because of the size of the institution, they have the staff. At rural colleges, right? When you're trying to change things, you're running into staffing issues at all turns, right? And so asking for institutional change, there's fewer faculty, fewer administrators to share the load of institutional change. And so things just didn't happen at the same pace, right? The way that, Tennessee certainly has rural colleges and they've managed to scale co-rec across the entire state, but it took a legislative mandate, and the studies by Ran and Lin and Ran and Lee and others have shown that there was an uneven pace of implementation there too. And I think, again, it fanned out in the same way that the places in the urban centers in the state moved first because they had the staff, they had the institutional resources. They were probably also they might have been much more connected to the research evidence, right? And so like research to practice happens faster when you're located close to your flagship four-year college and four-year university. Where when you're in a more remote area, things just don't translate as fast. And so to the extent that college systems can play a role of bringing faculty, bringing administrators together around these changes, that's probably important too, especially for the rural spaces where the information might not, the strategies, the support needed might not transmit as fast. Yeah.
And I have a question for any community college practitioners. How did these findings sort of square with your experiences? If you wouldn't mind sharing, I would be interested to hear that.
Well,
I guess we may not have enough people in those categories yet participating in the clinic, but I think from my own experience as a four-year college, very consistent, and it also ties in with our next clinic on sense of belonging, because some of the things that Dan was mentioning, really you can see the sense of belonging effect coupling with the co-requisite.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, I teach courses on sociology of education, so like this is right in my wheelhouse. And one of my good colleagues at Montclair is doing a lot of belonging stuff as well. Institutions send signals to students, right? Institutions send signals to people, and through policy and institutional judgments, like being judged by your institution as something or something else is going to have severe ramifications because we are social selves. We do internalize the perspective of the other. And if the other says, you're deficient in some way, you're going to feel bad. And if the institution in its geographic layout or in its messaging, promotes belonging, you feel like you students will take that on board as well. And so I think, we talk about belonging, my colleague always goes, it's more than just pizza parties, right? And to me, something like remedial placement is much more substantial than the presence or absence of pizza parties, right? That says, what does this institution think of you? What are you to this institution? Are you someone that's in need of correction, right? Prior to full membership, or are you a full member right away? Who's maybe in need of support. And these are very, very different institutional messages that are sent. Again, not necessarily in the posters we hang up on the walls, but much more in the transcripts and in the, you know, in the course assignments that we get, which are really the significant ways that we experience institutions. I'll show up for that next belonging one if I can. Sounds like a good talk.
Great. So we've hit our time. Thanks everyone for participating. Thanks so much, Dan, for really doing a fantastic job of bridging the gap between research and practice. This has been very, very enlightening, and we will get the references that were mentioned to you for for your further use in making the case to your colleagues and administrators for these kinds of models. I want to remind everyone.
I have like references at the back of my slides. I'm happy to share them.
Great. So thanks, Dan. We can use your
Yeah.
we'll PDF your slides and get them out to everyone, and the references are all listed at the end. June 18th, our next clinic is going to be on sense of belonging, and I'll put the link here to just make it easy for you to sign up if you haven't, and encourage your colleagues to participate as well. So thanks very much for your time, everyone. Look forward to seeing you on June 18th. Thanks again, Dan.
Ciao, y'all. See you.